All right, welcome everybody to this second and final lecture in our Global Middle Ages seminar series. I'm François Louis. I'm a professor of Chinese art and material culture here at Bard Graduate Center, and I'm extremely pleased to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Nigel Wood. Dr. Wood, as most of you surely know, is one of the most eminent specialists on Chinese ceramics. He has published over 100 articles and several books, most prominently and famously his 1999 volume on Chinese glazes. It's a book where he aptly combines technical knowledge that he acquired as a potter with scientific analysis and historical interpretation. The book is one of the few that I know that is both technical and yet eminently readable, very rare combination, and it appeals really to both art historians as well as potters trying to replicate Chinese glazes. It has like a really many virtues. It does remain in print. It's been reprinted in 2011, I saw on Amazon today, so you can still buy it, and it's certainly still relevant. Dr. Wood also published with Rose Carr the definitive volume on Chinese ceramic technology in the Needham series, Science and Civilization in China, that came out at Cambridge University Press in 2004. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Westminster, and while formally retired, he's still extremely busy. He's affiliated with the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford and involved in several research projects at the Palace Museum in Beijing, at the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and he's also currently working at a project on Samara, ceramics in Samara at the British Museum. And he has recently resumed, he's just told us, his work as a potter and is establishing, or has by now established, a ceramics studio as well. He's going to speak to us tonight on Tang Dynasty kiln site, and his lecture is entitled New Perspectives on China's Gongyi Kilns. So welcome, Nigel Wood.
Well, I thank Professor Louis very much for his introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be in subtropical New York. And the Bard Graduate Center has a wonderful reputation for the holistic way that it studies the material world, and bringing together many disciplines. And it's a great honor to be a small part of this program. Now, the subject of my lecture is the Gongyi Kilns, and they flourished really in the Tang Dynasty, as Professor Louis said, but their lifespan was short, and a lot of the production was funerary wares. But the more one studies the kilns at Gongyi, the more one becomes aware of just how original and influential they were. They didn't last for 1,000 years like Jingzhijian, or 2,500 years like the Yue kilns. And they didn't really survive much until into the Sung dynasty to contribute to the wonderful Sung ceramics. But what they did and what they produced was influential throughout China, and also, curiously enough, throughout the Middle East as well. The wares that were sent from Gongyi to Iraq in the 9th century triggered a revolution in Islamic fineware that spread right across the Islamic world. So it's a very important kiln site. And what I want to show this evening is some of the many facets of its production and how these came to influence other kilns in China and further away. So, as they say at the Oscar ceremonies, let's look at some of the work that they do. So, this is funerary ware from Gongyi, and bright polychrome lead glazed wares among their most famous productions, often on a very big scale. We're not quite sure if the very biggest figures were actually made at Gongyi, and this is certainly from a tomb very close to the kiln in south of Luoyang. But the wares near me are certainly excavated from one of the Gongyi kiln sites. So that was one facet of their production. And they also produced highly innovative wares. They produced what is probably the world's first translucent porcelain. They pioneered high-fired glazed white wares earlier in the 6th century, and by the end of the 6th century, they were actually producing translucent porcelain. So that is a very, very big achievement. They produced the first high-temperature cobalt blue and white ware, of which an example is near me. But one has to be quite careful with blue and white, because blue and white wasn't invented in China, as you can see further away. The Gongyi potters are about 2,000 years too late, to produce it. We're quite lucky to have a piece from dynastic Egypt, actually with cartouches, the pharaoh who used it. So blue and white as a concept, cobalt blue and white as a concept, is extremely ancient. What the Gongyi potters managed to do was to produce high-fired blue and white. But it rather fell on stony ground, and it wasn't until the 14th century that the concept was taken up again in Jingdezhen. But it was certainly a great innovation in its time. And it's something I want to talk about in more detail further on. And the low-temperature lead-glazed wares really had two incarnations. I tend to call it first generation and second generation Sansai ware. The first generation was essentially funerary ware of the highest quality and the greatest possible variety. It's one of the great riches of Chinese ceramics. The range of burial wares that were made for important royal tombs, aristocratic tombs around Chang'an and around Luoyang. But after the Anlushan rebellion and the decline in burial ceramics, Sansai almost disappeared from Gongyi, and then it was revived in the 9th century as a prime export ware. So the patterns were simplified and the shapes were quite simple, and it was a highly successful export product. And that is another aspect of the subject I want to talk about later. And of course they were famous for white wares. Having pioneered high-fired white wares in the world, they had a long tradition for making white wares. So when we look at some of the things that the Gongyi potters achieved, the world's first high-fired white ware, perhaps China's first white translucent porcelain in the sort of Sui Tang transition. China and the world's high-fired blue and white. The first use of the lime alkali glaze. This is a rather specialised thing, but it was actually very important. They pioneered a glaze type that was later used on what are sometimes called the five great wares. One can just about trace the succession and how that came about. And they also pioneered the idea of putting high temperature, of firing a pot to a high temperature and then putting a low temperature glaze on it. And this was really expediency to improve the strength of the wares for export. But it was something that was taken up again at Jingdezhen. Somebody once said about Jingdezhen that nothing was ever started there. Everything was taken from somewhere else, even though it had the most extraordinary long history and productive history of ceramics. So in a sense, Gongyi is important in that regard too. A major influence on northern kiln sites, as we shall see later on, a curious succession from Gongyi going northwards, and a major influence, as I mentioned, on Islamic ceramics. So it's quite a career, quite a place. So to start off with, the most important distinction probably in the whole of Chinese ceramics is this difference between north and south. It's not simply geographical, it's also geological. And it helps explain some of the curiosities of the subject. The line that you can see between the north and the south is actually a sign of tectonic convergence. And north of the line is a separate geological system, and south of the line is another separate geological domain. And of course, North China and South China look totally different. And the architecture is different, the food is different, the languages are often different. And when China was divided, in the north and southern Sung, it tended to divide on the same line. So before the bits converged 250 million years ago, you can see far away there North China, South China, Central Tibet, and gradually they came together by tectonic action and they merged, and they produced the present landmass of China. So we have two very distinct geological histories from North and South China, and this is reflected. And there was another twist that happened in North China when it was overwhelmed over the last 2.5 million years ago by dust blown from Inner Mongolian deserts. So the whole of North China, much of North China, is buried under a blanket of fine wind-blown rock dust called loess. And this has the great advantage of being infinitely fertile. So North China is a very fertile. It's the same as the prairies in America and the wheat fields in the Ukraine. It's the same material. So, and South China is, the rocks are visible. The original geology is very visible. It does look greener in this part of Anhui, but it is actually much harder to grow crops here in small terraced fields. So it's such a different landscape, North and South China. Well, Gongyi is an extremely historic part of China. One of its great treasures are the 7 tombs and 8 mausolea. The 7 tombs of the Sung emperors and one of the first emperor's father. And these are in wheat fields around the city of Gongyi. I remember seeing them in 1985. They have the most extraordinary presence. And the area is also, curiously enough, the heartlands of the early Tao culture. In fact, the old city of Yanshi is more or less Gongyi, and the excavations that are made at the early Tao sites, they sometimes include white earthenware vessels that use very much the same clay as was used a couple of thousand years later. But there is this very odd gap between the use of the white clay in the late Neolithic and the use of the white clay in the Northern Wei and the Northern Qi dynasty. 2,000 years absence of using the material. And even more extraordinary in a way is that one of the very earliest pieces of high-fired glazed ceramic ever found in China was actually found at the early Tao site. And it shows the prosperity of the Xia city. And the fact that the material was brought 600 miles from the south of China to this early Bronze Age site. So what you actually have at this site is the earliest high-fired glazeware from South China, where glazed ceramics started immensely early, in about 1600 BC, high-fired glazed ceramics. It's astonishing to see Bronze Age ceramics in the Chinese museums that are actually high-fired with high-temperature glazes. And at the same site, more or less, has been excavated the first high-fired wares made in North China, but there's a gap of about over 2,000 years between the piece here and the pieces there, for reasons we simply do not understand. You know, why North China should be so slow in developing a high-temperature ceramic tradition. So it's a rare convergence of two historical pieces. And the latest work on the origins of glazeware in China suggests that high-fired, high-temperature glazeware suggests that a site not far from Shanghai is the birthplace. But of course, you have to be very careful because the situation changes with every new excavation. And this is just how things are at the moment. But it does look as though these shards are perhaps the first glazed wares from China. High-fired glazed wares. And the composition of them is very close to kiln slag, the kind of material that collects inside a wood-fired kiln. There's quite a difference between a glaze that's made of wood ash, which one might expect, and a glaze that's made of kiln slag for various complex technical reasons. So it looks to me as though these first glazes were actually produced from material that was chipped out of the firebox or chipped off the inside of the kiln. But then the idea of using ash itself became established, and the great sort of greenware tradition developed in South China. And it continued from the early Bronze Age really right into the 13th, 14th century, making this kind of ware, a high-lime wood ash based glaze. So you had the production of high-temperature glazed ware firmly established in South China for centuries before it started in North China. The kind of kiln used in North China was entirely different as well. It's one of the other big differences between North and South China. And the excavations at Gongyi Kilns show the foundations for the kind of kiln I photographed in 1985 near the Shaolin Temple, which is a two-chimneyed, you can see the two chimneys here. A small, compact, well, this is unusually big actually for a manto kiln because it was firing great big field jars, but usually the kilns are only a couple of meters across or 3 meters across inside. So this is the kind of landscape in which the Gongyi potters would have operated, I guess, the Lewis landscape. And there are two kilns. It's very close to the Yangtze River. So the two kilns, Gongyi Kiln 1 and Kiln 2, the Beihe Kiln and the Huangye Kiln. And they're both very significant in the kiln site's history. It's very useful, the fact that the kiln site is built on rivers, particularly for transporting big pieces, you know, and also later on when export became an important part of the kiln site's operation. And there are two very recent papers on the technology of the wares that were produced. I'd heard about them over many years at different conferences, but publications that actually describe in full detail the technology have been pretty hard to find. But there are one paper on Gongyi white wares and one on Gongyi blue and white. And they came out this year and last year, so they're of great use for study. And the white wares were found in association with the greenish brown high-fired glazed wares. In South China you have this astonishing gap between the appearance of high-temperature stoneware, which is the early Bronze Age, and then the appearance of porcelain, which didn't happen until the early 10th century. So there's a great gap. But at North China, the two things happen simultaneously, more or less. High temperature glazed stoneware and glazed porcelain began at the same time, as we can tell, because these two pieces are stuck together and they're fired in the same kiln. So porcelain, or at least high-fired glazed whiteware and grey stoneware started simultaneously at this kiln site. Now, the prime candidate for the beginnings of white ceramics in North China for a long time was this kiln at Anyang, which is quite close to Gongyi, and of course another famous Bronze Age centre. But this has been slightly displaced now by the Gongyi finds. And they estimate that the firing temperature was pretty high, perhaps about 1260, 1270 degrees. And the material is surprisingly pure. You can tell the purity of it because when the lower down this line these dots are in this graph, the purer the materials that are being used. So you can see right at the beginning in the northern way, the iron levels are extremely low, and they actually crept up a bit later on. This is an example of what is described as a piece of northern way Gongyi whiteware. But it's a bit difficult to establish precedents because there's a kind of nexus of whiteware production in the same region. The Xing kilns, which again, although they're in southern Hebei, they're not that far from the Gongyi kilns. And they produced a white translucent porcelain, maybe slightly later than Gongyi, but there was an exhibition recently in Beijing that showed the shards, and they put a plastic Christmas tree or something inside to show just how translucent the material is. And this contained a huge amount of crushed powdered rock. And this is also a feature of the sort of igneous rock, a feldspathic rock. This is a feature too of some of the early Gongyi porcelains. So this is real porcelain. I mean, in North China, pure white translucent porcelain is extremely rare. Most North Chinese whiteware is actually non-translucent. It can be very white, but to find the two together, white and translucent, is unusual. And of course, it's not actually unprecedented in material history. If you think of Roman white glass, for instance, which is quite a lot earlier, white translucent material was made in the Roman Empire. And of course, in China, white jade has been a very long-running and famous material. So the jade cup that's in the new National Museum in Beijing is from the Sui dynasty. So there is a sort of a curious brotherhood between these various types of white translucent material. But in terms of composition, the Xing whiteware is very close to not to Bürkle porcelain, but to the Meissen porcelain that came after it. When Bürkle died in the 1720s, the new Meissen material was produced, a feldspathic material, and its composition is surprisingly close to translucent Xing whiteware. But of course, the time difference is huge. Late 6th century compared with the early 18th century in Germany, in Saxony. So another first, as it were, for the Gongyi kilns is to produce a type of glaze that was of a wonderful translucent jade-like quality, which is known as the lime alkali glaze. And it was used right from the beginning on the whitewares of Gongyi. But of course it doesn't look anything like Ruware or Guanware or Lungchuan Celadon. Because it's fired in oxidation. That's a clear burning atmosphere in the kiln, and that produces a creamy white material. But if the pot on your left were fired in reduction firing, it would have produced a glaze very similar to Ruware. And analysis shows just how original the potters were in producing this kind of glaze at such an early time. And although Chinese glazes are so spectacular and fascinating to study, there is actually really only two big themes. One is to add wood ash or limestone to clay, or a rock rather like clay that's quite impure. And that instantly gives you a range of greenwares. And the other approach is to add limestone or wood ash to an igneous rock, rather like granite. And that produces these very pure lime alkali glazes. And this can be considered as the southern approach, and this can be considered the northern approach. And it was the Gongyi Kilns, really, that pioneered this northern approach, and later spread to kilns like Yaozhou and the Ru kilns, and then returned back. So the greenware tradition, where they just use clay and ash in South China, I always think of it as the equivalent of monoculture, where you're growing the same crop year after year, century after century, even millennia after millennia. Whereas I tend to think of the northern kilns as more like mixed farming. They had quite a range of different wares that they had great facility in producing. And the three standard wares at the Gongyi Kiln really were the lead-glazed earthenware, black wares. If the lowest material melts into a black glaze spontaneously by itself, which is helpful, as there's unlimited supplies of it in North China, and the white wares. So this is a family of wares that were transmitted right successively and temporally through the north to the far north of China. First from Gongyi to the Anyang kilns, then to the Xin kilns at Lincheng, and then Chuyang, the Ding kilns, and then to the Longchuan kilns near Beijing, and then right into Inner Mongolia to the Chifeng kilns. And the series runs really from the 6th century successively, the Sui and the Tang. Ding kilns are early 9th century, and then after the Liao invasion, the northern kilns took over the principal. So the Xin kilns, we don't tend to think of the Xin kilns as producers of sansai wares much, or black wares, but there's a big exhibition in Beijing a few years ago, and it showed the full range of products from the Xin kilns. And of course they're famous for white wares, and the white wares are vastly superior to the Gongyi white wares, but the sansai wares are rather inferior. And what the market was for the sansai wares, I don't know. They look so much like export sansai to the Middle East, but it's not a very easy place to export sansai to the Middle East from. But it is suspected that some of the pieces on the Belitung wreck came from the Xin kiln. So we have this this trinity of products, and then it reappears at the Ding kilns. So, well, the Ding kilns certainly aren't very noted for sansai wares, but they were produced there. Black Ding ware is considered to be as rare as black swans, one of the famous descriptions for it. And of course it was a huge whiteware producer, the Ding kilns. But one can see the long reach of Gongyi, I think, in that the kind of wares that they chose to produce gradually spread northwards. And the Ding kilns were captured by the Liao, and the top craftsmen are rather like rocket scientists after the Second World War. They would have been highly regarded, and they were taken by the Liao to establish kilns near Beijing, and then much further north to Chifeng. So we have the same wares being made, but by sort of displaced Dingware potters who knew how to make these three different types of ware. And the most spectacular productions of the Longchuan Wu kilns were these huge lohan, of which I saw two in the Metropolitan Museum yesterday. And we had a research project at Oxford. We were very fortunate to be able to work on a piece from the interior of the Hermitage figure. And by pure good chance, I'd collected clay from the kiln site just outside Beijing, which is still in operation, the Luli Chu kiln, where these figures may have been made. And we found that the material was identical. So this is a sort of byway to the story, but it's at last we found out where these great figures were made. But they're about a metre tall, and of course, even in the Tang Dynasty, the potters were producing these colossal tomb figures for royal tombs to a very high sculptural standard. I mean, the great limestone figures outside Luoyang are in the same spirit, and the Sansai figures are not as big, obviously, but as well conceived. But as I said, that we're not absolutely sure whether all these big figures were made at Gongyi. They have found a bit of a horse, a large chunk of the back of a horse, and this is a horse from a tomb just south of Luoyang. So, as I say, the kilns are very close. So, but of course, you've got to transport them, even if it's only 50 miles. You have to transport them. It's not impossible that they were made closer to the tombs, perhaps by skilled craftsmen from the Gongyi Kilns. But there's no evidence for that yet. And the Sansai colours make use of a clear lead glaze with various metal oxides added to them. And white, amber, green and blue are the main colours that we use, cobalt blue. So one piece has been excavated and one sold recently at Sotheby's, considered to be from the same kiln. But when I looked at the excavation reports of Gongyi, I was staggered by how modern all the kiln furniture. Look, this is rather a potter's point of view, but this is a modern interior of a modern kiln. And you see the idea of a kiln shelf, kiln supports, these triangular spurs, they're still used extensively in the industry in Stoke-on-Trent. And even what are known as pyrometric cones that melt at certain predicted temperatures. If you take the Lurs material, it'll melt at about 1,000 degrees in the kiln. These are later than Gongyi, but it's not impossible that they may have used rather similar guides to kiln firing. So we're still on the trail of these three different types of ware: black ware, white ware, and lead glazed ware, and it tends to come to a halt in Inner Mongolia. But you can see the quality that was produced in white ware, which shows the skills of the displaced Ding potters. I don't think this could have developed as a native skill in the region. It was introduced, and although of course the forms are very nomad based on leather vessels. So the influence that spread northwards from Gongyi is very obvious, but there's another influence which is not so well known, and that is really from north to south. And this is from the Gongyi kilns to the Changsha kilns. And again, this was a product of the An Lushan rebellion. And potters left Gongyi at this time, and they moved south. And they took with them a lot of their decorative techniques and concepts of glaze use. But of course, they were producing high-fired stoneware when they went to Changsha, rather than low-fired Sansai ware. But a lot of the spirit is very close. And it's most obvious in this odd decorative method that they used at the Gongyi kilns. Rather of producing brush designs and patterns, they built up a glaze mosaic. These glazes are very fluid, so they don't lend themselves to brushed patterns, but you can build very strong patterns, probably based on Central Asian textiles, simply by dotting and dabbing the coloured glazes. And this is something that was transferred to Changsha in the middle there. And another popular Gongxian decorative technique was what potters call sprigging, which is you take a shallow mould, fill it with clay, and you print it onto the side of a pot. And this suddenly appears on Changsha wares, again probably from the influence of Gongxian potters. But of course the great innovation is the blue and white, and we can see the development of it. These pieces are from the Gongyi Kiln, and the only extant piece I know that is of this style is the famous piece in Hong Kong, which is illustrated there. And they simply adapted the whiteware material, and I think maybe applied blue cobalt glaze. It's a bit difficult to know whether it's underglaze or overglaze at this stage, but I think this is the very beginnings of the high temperature blue and white at the Gongyi Kilns. The blue glaze had already been used on Sansai burial wares very effectively in this kind of abstract expressionist style for the true funerary wares. But these are low-fired, and the glaze is dabbed on with a brush, blue glaze on top of the white glaze, or the clear glaze. So the progress seems to be from the low-temperature blue and white, which is early 8th century, and then in the 9th century, probably early in the 9th century, to a simplified export ware, still low-fired, that used the blue glaze, and then finally to the high-temperature blue and white, which is at the bottom of the picture. So we can see the succession of this technique. And I was very curious a few years ago, when working on Islamic blue and white, to know how close the pigments were in composition between Iraq in the 9th century and China in the 9th century. So we were lucky enough to be able to use pieces from the Ashmolean Museum, shards from Iraq, and whole pieces from the Ashmoleans' collection. And what we saw was that the pigments aren't the same. They're both iron cobalt ores, but the Chinese pigment is much higher in cobalt, and it doesn't contain zinc, which the Middle Eastern pigment does. It's often said that this blue pigment came from the Middle East. Well, it may well have done, but it's certainly not the same as the pigment that was being used at the same time in Iraq. And the source for the pigment in Iraq seems to be Turkey, or it has been suggested by my glass colleagues that it was from Turkey. So the simple dot and dash decoration may be the earlier, and rather more structured painted decoration from a different kiln at Gongxian is slightly later. And these sort of tentative brush painted pieces are from Yangzhou, which was the great sort of marshalling yard where ceramics were collected from North China and South China ready for export to the Middle East. And they were sent along the Grand Canal to Yangzhou, which is quite a way inland, but it's still a major port, and via the Grand Canal. And interestingly enough, lead isotope analysis on the Gongxian lead glazes shows that the lead came from South China, whereas the Sansai wares that were made near Chang'an, that lead came from North China. Of course, lead is a heavy material, so the Grand Canal was ideal for bringing lead for glazes from South China to Hunan province. And one of the most famous of all blue and white Sansai pieces, blue and white high-fired Gongxian pieces, are these dishes that were made in true Abbasid Islamic style. My colleague at Oxford, Oliver Watson, who's a great expert on Islamic ceramics, thinks they may have been samples that were produced in the hope of getting big orders, because they didn't get to the Middle East. wrecked off Indonesia. So that story came to an end. But there are obviously copies, the designs are copies of Middle Eastern palm patterns. Having been to Gongyi, I don't remember seeing any palm trees there, so I'm pretty sure that this is an imported Middle Eastern pattern. Now, Islamic blue and white is a story in itself, but the general consensus has been that it's a spontaneous and independent production in the Middle East, and that although the forms are a lot to imported bowls from China, the decoration is completely local. And this leads to the idea that these were a local development, that they started independently from China, the idea of blue and white. But quite recently, I've been working on a shard that was found at Siraf in southern Iran. And this was a stopping off point for the ships from importing wares from China. And amongst 17,000 shards of glass and metal and plaster and ceramic was one piece of blue and white, from high temperature blue and white from Gongyi. And it was collected in the 70s, but the collection's only just been catalogued at the British Museum. So, also of interest, in the same context, were found Iraqi blue and white shards that seem to show a direct debt to China, rather than being in the local patterns that are more familiar from Iraqi blue and white. So we have a tentative idea that, well, it seems that blue and white did reach the Middle East from Gongyi, and this wasn't believed before. But there's also the possibility that the material was imitated. But of course the chronology is vague, and we don't really know if this was just one aspect of Iraqi blue and white, or whether it triggered the whole tradition. So that remains to be looked at in more detail. So I suppose to say the wares were exported from China is slightly vague in that what the Arab merchants did is they went to China and bought them and collected them and brought them back to the Middle East. And in the Belitung Rec exhibition that's going to be in New York, opening in a few days' time, tells the story. But this is the Belitung Rec is a 9th century wreck from the second quarter of the 9th century, and it contained tens of thousands of pieces of Changsha ware, and also those famous Gongyi blue and white dishes, amongst many other treasures. And the ships were of Indian Ocean design, and they were made of planks that were sewn together, lashed together with cord, and cross-stitched together and then corked to make them waterproof. And the sea journeys would have been, they would have taken months. They follow the monsoonal winds. Even today it takes about 30 days to sail from Shanghai to the Middle East. So you can imagine the timescales that are involved in these trading voyages. And they'd intended, when they got to the Middle East, to have unloaded in Siraf, because the Iraqi port of Basra is very treacherous. Although it's a very important port, there's lots of sandbars and fast currents. So they would have taken the wares in smaller boats from Siraf to Iraq. And many, many years ago at Oxford, long before the Belitung Rec was publicised, they sent us shards to analyse, and this was not the great fine jug that's probably in the show, but this broken piece here. And what we were able to see was that it was high-fired stoneware, high-temperature stoneware. It had a high-temperature firing, and then the lead glaze had been applied. As I was mentioning earlier, this is one of the inventions of the Gongyi potters. And it's simply, burial ware doesn't have to stand a lot of knocking about, but export wares that go 7,000 miles need to be quite a lot tougher. So they would have been pre-fired to high temperature. So they'd have gone to Siraf and then on to Iraq and to the capital, probably at Samarra. And this famous dish that's in the, I think it's either the British Museum or the V&A, for many years it was thought to be a Zoroastrian fire altar that it was depicting. But there's a very good suggestion by Jessica Hallett, who studied Basra very closely, that it's actually a depiction of the lighthouse at Basra. I mentioned how treacherous the port was. So, but Samarra is important because it was what one might call a pop-up capital. It only lasted for a few decades and wasn't really supported by, it was simply on the Tigris River, and it was the capital of the Abbasid Empire, and massive investment, and then it was abandoned and the capital moved to Raqqa. But it does mean that there are masses of shards, some Chinese and some local copies of the Chinese wares. And this tray of shards in the Victoria and Albert Museum really gives a snapshot of the kind of wares that were excavated from the more prestigious archaeological sites, the palace sites in Samarra. And I put it in because it emphasizes the way that the Gongyi potters were able to export to the Middle East, and then the local potters were able to copy those wares that were exported. So these pieces are, most of them are imitations of Gongyi wares, and if they're not Gongyi wares, then they're copies of Changsha wares, which owe quite a lot of their character to Gongyi itself. So it's the long reach of this Gongyi Kilns site. The local material in Iraq is very fusible. It melts very easily. So it's not a high temperature material by any means, but the local potters used very advanced glass technology to produce a very fine superficial resemblance to imported Gongyi whitewares and even Xing wares and perhaps even Ding wares by putting tin oxide in the glaze. This is the beginnings of tin opacified glazes. So you can see how their clay melts. This is Iraqi local clay, and as soon as you get above about 1080, it begins to deform and melt and turn into a green glass. So it's hopeless for high temperature ceramics, but it was cleverly adapted superficially to copy the imported wares. And we did quite a big project at Oxford on the Iraqi imitations of imported Chinese wares. So the Iraqi copies are on further away from me, and these are the Chinese originals. And somehow they had got hold of classic early 8th century funerary wares that they managed to copy in Abbasid Iraq. And that's a shard from the Victoria and Albert Museum, whereas these are Chinese originals closer to me. And this shard was of huge interest because on the other side of it, it had a style which later became very popular in the Middle East, called sgraffito, where they scratched through a white slip and with a splashy lead glaze on top of it. So there's two things happening on the same piece. And then this spirit is taken up right across the Islamic world, and as far away as Uzbekistan, and almost back to China again. Whereas the Changsha wares are also copied. This is fairly complicated because furthest away from me in the middle is from the Belitung wreck. Above it is another Chinese dish excavated at Samarra before the First World War. And below it is another dish from Samarra excavated before the First World War but made locally. And we saw the influence on Changsha ware earlier to produce these green and white splashed wares. So this shard that we looked at is really a copy of the Changsha version of the Gongyi green splashed ware with a tin oxide opacified glaze. So right across the Islamic world, the inheritance of Islamic fine wares is directly from these imports in Iraq from China. And this reaches back really to Changsha wares in its style. And the kilns that we used right across the Middle East are quite different from those used in China, and they're quite consistent, and they're very often about the same size, all the way from Morocco to the borders with China itself. These updraft kilns with perforated floors. They're quite different from the classic kilns that I mentioned at the beginning from Gongyi, which are known as they're cross-draft kilns. The flame goes horizontal, and they have these two chimneys. So, to summarise, the Gongyi kilns, they inspired the manufacture of similar wares throughout North China. They produced some of the very earliest high-fired glaze wares in North China, the earliest high-fired white wares in North China, and the very first translucent porcelains anywhere in the world. They produced a style of glaze that was later used throughout North China and reached its finest use for imperial celadons. They made the world's first high-temperature blue and white, and they applied lead glazes to high-fired wares in an enamels en bisque style. And they influenced the type of wares that were made at the kilns that I mentioned, going up through the sort of porcelain corridor. And they had a profound influence on South Chinese Changsha wares. And thence to the Middle East. So they really are important, even though they only flourished for a relatively short time. They're highly innovative and highly influential. So, this is the Gongyi kiln. This is the Oriental Ceramic Society in 1995, and we have the person in the foreground, well in the red jacket, in the audience this evening. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nigel. We have time for questions. Yes.
Nigel, was the cobalt used in the Gongyi blue and white from Persia, or was it local?
The Persian cobalt is local. We've got a local to Persia.
Right, but I meant local to China. Was it cobalt blue from China, or was it imported from Persia?
Oh, sorry, June to June, you mean?
Oh, the Gongyi kiln, in fact...
I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
No, we don't know where it came from.
Oh.
There is a paper published on it, but it gives 6 alternatives, one of which is South Africa, one of which is somewhere in Hebei, which sounds curious, and we simply don't know. But my suspicion is it's from Afghanistan, because I have seen analyses of blue tiles from Afghanistan that have that same curious composition. And of course, it didn't really carry on being used after the fall of the Tang dynasty, where China wasn't quite so open to trade. So if it were a Chinese pigment, perhaps it would have survived that. But it's certainly very different from the Iraqi pigment.
Any questions?
Yes, I was wondering whether the white translucent was to imitate white jade.
I guess it's extremely difficult when a new technology is beginning to know quite what is happening, because there does seem a conscious effort of experiment. I mean, I've looked at some pieces in the, or at least my colleagues have sent me pieces in the Palace Museum in Beijing. Although the glaze is completely consistent, the body is very experimental, and there's all sorts of different compositions at this very early stage. So there was a research and development stage, certainly, and it did look as though it was towards producing a translucent material. So quite what the motives were, I'm not sure, but the effect was to produce a translucent ceramic. But jade is a very likely possibility. But there's also an outside chance it may have been Roman glass, because I think the import of glass from, exotic glass from from the West. It's part of China's story.
Could it possibly be a coincidental discovery, or is this something you have to really try to strive and work this out as a part?
Well, as somebody once said, all pottery is theft. You know, you have to assume that it's been taken from somewhere as a sort of default opinion first. It's particularly in skeuomorphism in ceramics, even Neolithic ceramics. So the idea that there might be another material that was being imitated, I think, is quite valid, really. But this is, I guess, what makes the kiln site so fascinating, because it does produce such original productions and to such a high level. And of course, we've seen the influence that created. So, quite what was happening, the beginnings of a tradition are always interesting because there's everything to play for, and one doesn't know which way it's going to go. So, quite what was happening is difficult to second guess, I think.
Further questions?
This doesn't have to do with the kilns, but it has to do with the earth, the loess.
Yes.
And so the bodies of the pieces, did they contain less iron over time as we come forward in time?
Well, the loess is rather like the Iraqi earthenware clay in that it melts very easily and it turns into a black glass at quite a low temperature. One of the suggestions as to why high-fired ceramics was so slow to get started in North China is simply because the materials were much more inaccessible. High-temperature materials are exposed everywhere in South China, and you can take them more or less as they are, but most of North China is covered by many meters of loess, and the ancient rocks, the ancient high-temperature, the high-firing clays are much lower. So, although loess was used on a colossal scale for Neolithic ceramics and for Han burial wares, the high-temperature clays had to be specially found. They had been discovered in the early Bronze Age, as we saw, but then they were forgotten about, and they had to be rediscovered in order to make the kind of wares that we've been looking at. So the loess itself has got limited usefulness as soon as you get into high-temperature ceramics.
The fact that it in the kiln, high-temperature kiln, it turns black, does that mean that there is iron in it?
Yes. The loess has about 6% iron.
Yes.
Yeah, it has everything in it, actually. If you take the average composition of the Earth's crust and compare it with loess, it's exactly the same. And its mineralogy is infinitely complicated, although it's such an abundant common material. It does, yeah, which is why it melts so easily, because it's got so many alkalis and alkaline earths and other materials in it.
Eileen, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. That was really, really great. I'm just wondering, the Gongyi is the present name for Gongxian.
Yes.
And during the Tang Dynasty, it was a district. I'm
Aha.
trying to understand the
The-
administration, you know, and in terms of the institutional context in which these kiln sites might have been, you know, they were operating.
Yes.
Like who financed them?
Absolutely.
Was it public funded or private for commercial kilns? And is there any textual historical documents suggesting
Well,
the kind of status that these centers?
it's not my specialism, but we've got a graduate student at Oxford who's doing a DPhil, and this is exactly her subject. That to try and establish the way that government, more or less government-run operations, as you might have in the 9th century, developed in the Sung dynasty in the 10th, 11th century into private enterprise. I mean, the Gongxian burial wares were produced at no expense spared. If you think of the time and the craftsmanship and the skill and the losses, and you know those wonderful big tomb figures, they were prestige wares of the highest order. So they must have been subsidized. But when it comes to export, quite who benefited and at what stage of the process is much more difficult to tell, I think, with the export sansai wares. And it's a very interesting subject. And it's also to do with deeper aspects of Chinese economy, such as transfer of money from one city to another by check and things like this. It's happened later in the Sundance. So
Is the Yellow River, how far is the center from the river? Because when you think of export, it has to go through the river transport.
well, I'm not sure how navigable the Yellow River
Or other rivers.
but there's a river that runs parallel to it, that runs from Gongyi to Loyang,
Okay.
and then it joins the Grand Canal. So it could be that it wasn't the Yellow River that was used. It was maybe the smaller rivers. But it's not. Again, it's not my specialism as to how. But it is an extraordinary distance. See, these kilns developed in interior of China to supply the local demand, and then in the 9th century they were developed for export. But they were miles and miles from the seaports. So and Changsha, of course, is hundreds of miles up the Yangtze River, but it made virtually nothing but export wares. So it was quite an operation, to move them to the ports.
Louise, you had a question?
If I understood correctly, you were not absolutely decided about the first use of blue and white, whether it was...
Yes. Well, the first, if you're competing China against Iraq, you find blue and white being used in burial wares in the early 8th century, earthenware. Whereas the Iraqi blue and white didn't begin until the beginning of the first quarter of the 9th century. So China was definitely earlier in terms of the concept of blue and white than Iraq. But then, of course, the Middle East was miles ahead anyway, because they were producing blue and white in ancient Egypt. So, in terms of the problem between Iraq and China,
particular types of bowls.
it's quite possible that it was a spontaneous creation in Iraq. But there is this curious shard that we found, and associated shards, that suggest that it may have been triggered by imports from of blue and white from China. So the jury's out on that, I think. The Arabists would say that it was Iraq first. Fred Oliver Watson wouldn't have any of this. So it's
you mentioned that there's some thought that dotted in particular sansai ware was originally influenced by textile design.
yes.
Was there any the evidence for that is, and whether textiles themselves are extant or whether it's from illustration?
I think yes. I think there are extent. There was a DPhil published by one of Jessica Rawson's students a few years ago on Tang Sansai, and she illustrated the Central Asian textiles and also the Sansai parallels. But there is a sort of cautionary note. As somebody once said, it's very easy to find a parallel and call it an influence. But I think it is highly likely. There was this fascination for West Asian design and art in the Tang dynasty, because of course the Tang royal family were essentially from that region. So I think it's a double thing. I think it's probably an influence from textiles, but also a practical thing that when you're working with coloured lead glazes, you can't do much with them other than paint them side by side, because they all tend to flow together in the kiln. If you try and brush a pattern of one colour on another colour. So this kind of dotted effect, though it's rather curious, is very practical. But of course it's enormously time consuming. So those wonderful jars that have all that decoration were very slow to produce. And when they came to produce export sansai, they just took elements from that style and put the simplest details on and turned them out in big quantities. But there you can see their roots, in the funerary style.
But were not resist patterns being used on textiles from a very early time, that they might have transferred that a little bit of that
Could,
sort of-
yeah, could well be, but some of the designs are quite specific. I'm trying to remember the name of the. It's online actually. If you look up DPhil thesis from Oxford on Sansai, it would bring it up. But I think some of the parallels were very specific actually between the surviving textiles.
Certainly some of the sprig molded pieces, they found exact sort of, you could see them on the textiles and then
Really?
produced
Yeah.
on it.
Well, there is an odd, when you look at the very highest quality of Tong Sansai, and you look at some of the detail, there's evidence of resist being used. And it's a clay resist, rather like textiles. And they've used a clay resist, they put a glaze on, and they put dots of clay on, and they put another glaze on top, dab another glaze on top. And they've picked off the clay, and of course it brings the glaze underneath with it. So you get these bald spots on the Tong Sansai, on the very best pieces.
Do you think they were using wax possibly, or?
I think they've analysed it, and I think it was kaolin. So, but it is essentially, well, it's very similar to wax resist as a process.
Okay, with one more question, if there is one. All right, if not, then let me thank Nigel Wood again.